All right, everyone, we're going to get started. Thank you for coming. This is a very important message in this time and day that we live in, right? And so let me just introduce Viktor Branditsky. So Viktor was born, raised, and educated in Kiev, Ukraine. In 1975, he immigrated to the United States to join his American wife, Lily, and he was the first Ukrainian in 58 years of the Soviet regime to legally marry an American. Author of the autobiography, From Soviets to Savior, which is a book he has for sale here tonight, Viktor Branditsky will share with us his journey from communism to freedom. So I also asked Viktor tonight to start by sharing with us a little bit of the history of the Soviet Union, how did they become communists? How did that happen? Because I'm noticing in nations across the world who are moving into a socialist form, it's typically not by choice. And so I think in America, we kind of maybe dismiss countries thinking, well, they chose wrong, too bad for them, but it seems to be just happening to them against their will. So, yeah. So he's going to share with us a bit about Ukrainian and Soviet history, how that came to be, and then share his story. And Viktor is going to open with a song for us. So come on up. And I told him that we sometimes start with a song. So if there was a song that he wanted us to play, and he says, I can actually play one myself. So we'll start with that.
Well, good evening, everybody. I greet you in the powerful name of our Lord Jesus Christ, the soon coming King. What a privilege to know him. When I see faith and freedom, I wish I could bring my t-shirt with Galatians 5:1. I have a very nice t-shirt. It's my witnessing t-shirt. And so people usually ask, what does that say? Well, it does say, it is for freedom that Christ called us. Then it says, stand firm, therefore, and do not submit again to a yoke of slavery. And so when they asked me about the yoke of slavery, I said, well, do not submit to that. We submitted to that 4 years ago, did we not? Unfortunately. So it was a yoke of slavery. I will start by saying something that you probably heard of many times, but maybe Reader's Digest version of how socialism and communism came about. Well, first maybe a little on a light note. Our beloved President Reagan, a patriot, I just love Reagan, and he was talking to Gorbachev. In fact, in my book, you will read a story how I was privy to Governor Perpich's invitation of Gorbachev to come to Minnesota. should I tell you the story real quick? I'll tell you the story. I was teaching at the University of Minnesota, and there was a call from John Chol. John Chol has a company, Better Than Money Corporation. And he says, Victor, what are you doing now? I said, well, I'm teaching the class. And he says, well, come on over. A governor wants to see you. We have a dignitary from Moscow. Oh. Usually people who come from Moscow, they're fat, very unattractive, apparatchiks, you know. I said, well, are there any other interpreters? He says, no, we need you. Okay. So I go all the way to St. Paul, and there's this one guy, you know, tall, handsome, looks like a Scandinavian movie star. I couldn't believe it. I said, well, hi, my name is Victor. He says, my name is Yuri Uralov. Now, folks, Yuri Uralov was a very important guy. He was a biographer of Raisa Gorbachev, and he was also Deputy Minister of Culture of Ukraine. We started talking, and I said, well, you obviously did something with athletics. He says, I was a swimmer. I said, really? I was a swimmer too. So we started talking about backstroke. In just several minutes, we became very close, started talking about results for 100 meter, how he was doing that. And I said, well, I have a trick, because when the world champion came to Kiev, and his name escapes me, but it'll come to me. He taught me how to do it faster than others. And he says, how so? I said, here's how it was. Usually you go all the way there, but the trick is to go over here and go a little faster. So that way you have more strokes. We started talking. He says, well, that's interesting. Perpich was just about to be reelected, remember? And so I started talking to Yuri, and Yuri says, well, Gorbachev will be in New York for 50th anniversary of NATO, and he's going to see Bush Sr. in California. I said, that's perfect. He will probably be flying through Minnesota. He says, yes. How about stopping by? Because we were sort of, you know how liberal we are in Minnesota. We had some cities in Russia that we were sister cities with and all of that stuff. Well, then Perpich went someplace and then came back, and I said, well, Mr. Governor, you know, we might see Gorbachev. He says, Victor, if we see Gorbachev in Minnesota, you'll be my lieutenant governor automatically. And I said, well, that's a good idea. So we started talking seriously, and then within a week, there was a call from Moscow, from this one guy who was actually director of a spy institute in Moscow. And he says, how serious are you to receive the premier? And of course, Perpich said, absolutely serious. Now, folks, you remember that Perpich was a Slavic governor, one out of 50 governors of the United States. I could understand his language because I speak several languages, including Russian, Ukrainian, and Polish. So he spoke Serbo-Croatian. He was a Croat, as you remember. So he loved that. He would talk about some other people in derogatory terms. And I said, should I interpret? He says, absolutely not. Don't do that. So that's how in 1999, Gorbachev came to Minnesota, remember, for a couple hours with Raisa. And it was very blustery afternoon. I will never forget that. But I was interviewed by Channel 5, and when they said Victor Brunitsky, then they said practicing Christianity. I said it's almost like practicing voodoo or something like that. Practicing Christian. So they interviewed me about, you know, Russians in Ukraine and their situation, and Christians in Ukraine. So, anyways, so here's your that's a true story to you. Some of you might have heard about that. But when Reagan was talking to Gorby, he actually said the following. I'll read that for you. Well, during the exchange with Michael Gorbachev, President Reagan asked him if socialism had been invented by scientists or politicians. Remember that one? Well, Gorby replied, politicians. Well, the scripted retort from Reagan was, of course it was politicians. Scientists would have had the decency to at least try it on rats first to see that it didn't work. So there was a light moment there. I don't know where to begin. A few, maybe some historic data about Marxism. Many people don't realize that it was not Marx who actually started the deal, but there were a number of philosophers before him who thought that the world should be different, like it was from the very beginning. It's utopia, right? Well, the biblical account does say that at some point people had everything in common in the Acts of the Apostles, and they were given to each one of them according to their needs. So, pre-Marxist communism, I made a few notes here. While Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels defined communism as a political movement, so they said it was political movement, okay? There were already similar ideas in the past which one could call communist experiments. There was experiments, actually experiments on people. Marx himself saw primitive communism as the original hunter-gatherer state of humankind. That's his philosophy. Marx theorized that only after humanity was capable of producing surplus did private property develop, and probably right along with IRS as well. So Marx saw communism as the original state of mankind from which it rose through classical society. So all of that philosophizing. Okay. Then, so who were the first pre-Marx socialist thinkers? There were several, but one of note was none other than Jean-Jacques Rousseau. In fact, we studied Jean-Jacques Rousseau in the former Soviet Union. Okay? Now, Jean-Jacques Rousseau was a Genevan philosopher. He was also a writer and, among other things, a composer, whose works influenced the French Revolution. Okay? Now, who was the first Marxist? In the 1840s, German philosopher and sociologist Karl Marx, who was living in England after fleeing the authorities in Prussia, where he was considered a political threat, began publishing books in which he outlines his theories for a variety of communism now known as Marxism. Okay? Now, who was the predecessor of Marx? That's interesting. Many Americans are not aware of that. There was a lady, French feminist. Her name was Laura Tristan. Have you heard of Laura Tristan? Okay. She may be the one as a predecessor of Marx and Engels. Okay. Now, in Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels referred to critical utopian socialism, particularly drawing attention to three people. First is Louis Saint-Simon, French. Robert Owen was the second one, and Charles Fourier. So those pretty much are among the first ones that started the idea, planted the seed. Yet, yes, there could be very nice communism, bloodless communism. We all know that communism is nothing but disaster. And I lived through that disaster for 27 years. I'll tell you about that later. So according to Webster Dictionary, communism is a social system and theory in which goods are owned in common and are available to all as needed. Okay, that's the definition. Another definition of communism is a theory advocating elimination of private property. So, under communism, most property and economic resources are owned and controlled by the state. That actually started from 1917 in Russia, or the former Soviet Union. Now, rather than individual, citizens. Now, socialism, however, involves, according to Charles Fourier, okay, limited private ownership, government and private entities, limited class distinction, production for societal needs, according to Charles Fourier. That's what he thought. Now, as far as capitalism is concerned, well, it involves, and that's according to Adam Smith, that's another philosopher, total private ownership, market forces, class distinction, production for profit. That's capitalism. I would like to quote a couple of people in there from England. The former Prime Minister of Great Britain, Winston Churchill, characterized socialism as follows. Socialism is a philosophy of failure, the creed of ignorance, and the gospel of envy. Its inherent virtue is the equal sharing of misery. That's what he said. Now, former Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher said very aptly this following: the problem with socialism is that sooner or later you will run out of other people's money. That's your socialism, okay? Couple more things. So the entire country. Now, when we say USSR, you know what it stands for. Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. The former USSR, or the Soviet Union, was comprised of 15 republics. We have 50 states. There are 15 republics, of which Russian Federation was the largest, followed by Ukraine. Ukraine was the largest territory, and Ukraine, so that we understand that, is a little shy of the territory of Texas. It's a huge, huge territory. In fact, Ukraine is the second largest territory in Europe after unified Germany. Okay, so that's why Putin is eyeing this land, and we'll talk about this guy in a moment. So I have lived in USSR. My family, my father was a colonel, incidentally. I come from a military family. Father was a colonel, full bird, they say, and he was in the Corps of Engineers. He was a PhD also of military fortifications, and he went all the way to Berlin. Every time I say that now, I smile. You know why? Because I was invited to talk to Mennonites in North Dakota. Now, you understand, Mennonites are of German descent. So here I am talking about my father. I said, my father was a highly decorated officer. He went all the way to Berlin. And they just looked at me, well, you know, they didn't take it right. In other words, you know, they were still very patriotic Germans. That's what I'm trying to say. So my mother was a high school principal, and I actually studied at her school. So you understand that I had to be the absolutely best in everything. They were looking at, you know, directors, they call it directors, principal's son. So both were ardent communists, and they truly believed in that. Now, I want to take it back and say that out of 250 million, formally, 250 million citizens of the USSR, less than 10% were communists. Less than 10%. It was for promotions. You had to be really ideologically strong. You have to believe all of that stuff. You have to remember what Lenin said, what Marx said, what the Communist Manifesto is all about. So it was indoctrination from day one, as I remember. You know, we were young pioneers with red ties, okay, pioneers, like scouts here. Then we become Komsomol members. Komsomol is the Young Communist League, okay? And then very few become communists. In military, pretty much if you're the officer, you're a communist, primarily. It had to be the Lord. I was first lieutenant, special forces, and I was not a communist. There's a time when they look at you and in trial period and stuff like that. Well, I never believed in the system. I always hated the system. And we studied languages, obviously, and I started learning more and more about the United States and Great Britain, and I realized that people live differently there. And then there was a democracy, and people could express their ideas and stuff like that. That was absolutely forbidden in the former Soviet Union. You could not talk about politics. You could not talk about how bad our government is. And if you do, like today in Russia, people get prison terms. You remember the ballerina that sent $52 to support somebody in Ukraine, and she was from US? She had dual citizenship. And guess what? She arrives to Moscow, she's arrested, and my understanding she'll be serving 3 years for, quote unquote, supporting Ukraine with her dollars and stuff. So today in Russia, it's completely totalitarian. You cannot, well, they're all brainwashed. You know, they believe that Putin is the czar of czars. If they, folks, vote 87% for their president, it tells you something about the population of Russia. Because I hear some maybe naive Americans saying, well, Victor, they're not all supporting him. I agree, not all. Some of them out of fear. If you say something against him, that's bad news. But 87% tells you something about it, that it's really, really, really bad. Well, I'm trying to get a few stories and tell you about my life and squeeze that in 76 years of my life. Well, I would like to tell you how I met Lily. I was a student at Kiev State University, and in fact, it'd be great if you were to hear that from her, but she's a very shy girl. Yes, she is very shy, very shy. So Lily's traveling to the former Soviet Union with a friend of hers, American of Norwegian descent, Christy, and she actually was in Ukraine, but on the way to Moldova because she had an aunt in Moldova. Lily's parents' story is next to miraculous too. It's a miracle she is alive. She comes from a family of a Polish, I would probably say he was a master carpenter, Daniel, and mother was from Ukraine, so Polish-Ukrainian. When the war started September 1st of 1939, he was within the cavalry battalion. Well, Germans started advancing on their bikes and machine guns and stuff, so horses were not exactly, up to par with all of that, and they cannot match. So Poland fell within less than a couple days. The entire country was conquered by the Germans. Then their trips all the way through Siberia, how they suffered, how they were walking on snow and all of that stuff. Lily actually wrote a chapter in the book, that possibly chapter 6, with pictures and stuff like that, explaining what they went through. Lily's mother was taken as a, a young girl. She was, 16, 17, to labor camps. Nazis took her to labor camp, and she was there for the entirety of the war. So then she became a DP, or displaced person. She met Daniel there, a Polish prisoner, and it's by the miracle of God that she got into the Polish zone. Had it been Ukrainian zone, Stalin had an agreement that all prisoners would have to go back to the Soviet Union. Guess where else? Siberia. None of them lived in any cities, nothing. It was all camps for them. They were dying by thousands. Excuse me. So Lily came to Kiev. That's a very cute story, but I'll tell you that real quick. She is actually touring Kiev and met this one couple. Actually, two of them, a lady and her. What happened to my voice? A lady and a little girl. The girl was about 7 or 8 years old. And so before that, I met those guys at the restaurant. I was with a friend, so there was a big table, and the maitre d' or the host came and said, well, do you mind if two Americans will be sharing the table? I said, sure. So and I was with a friend. We both spoke English at that time, but we noticed that the lady had an accent, Slavic accent, possibly Ukrainian, but the girl spoke standard American. And so we didn't say anything, but we were just listening to them. And so the girl is complaining how bad in tourist service is, how Americans are not treated properly and stuff like that. So I smiled because I knew it was bad. So she says, where are you from? And I said, well, I was in a mischievous mood. I said, guess. Mind you, it's September. We're dark there in Kiev because of Dnieper River and beautiful beaches. And she says, well, she went all around South America, maybe Latin America, maybe this. And then she says, are you Cuban? Now, folks, we had Cubans galore in the 60s and 70s. It's because when Castro, was ruling the country, all of those other thugs, absolute thugs, like what we're getting now through the border, would come to Ukraine, to Russia, illiterate, and yet they gave them apartments and they were studying in Ukraine, studying communism, how to continue with their country. So I said, no, I'm not Cuban. And I had my passport, so I showed my passport and said, I'm Ukrainian. And mother starts crying, and I said, why are you crying? And she says, I'm Ukrainian too, like as if we didn't know. We knew that she would. And so we started talking. We invited both of them and then she says, listen, I met those two girls, and one of them is of Slavic descent. That's Lily. And they were very cute, and you probably would want to meet them. I said, sure. So we agreed to meet at the hotel room, and that's how I met Lily for the first time. She was 19. You can imagine. I have pictures when she was 19. In fact, I forgot to tell you, we just celebrated 50th anniversary. It was September 10th. So we started talking, and Lily says, the first thing you ask a person, where are you from? I was just about to tell her where I was from, and that little girl says, can you guess? So Lily also went into a few countries, not Ukraine, and then finally she says, are you Cuban? I said, no, I'm no Cuban. So we started talking, and then we invited them over to our apartment. My mom was very hospitable person because I'm 1/4 Armenian. My mom's father was from Persia, but he was Armenian. There's an amazing story about him in my book. Amazing story, how he comes to Ukraine. So anyways, then we started corresponding. Then Lily came back a couple times before that. Her mother came, I have to tell you that. Mother came in 1971. And mother is an evangelical Christian, a Baptist. And so she says, would you like to come to church with me? I said, sure. Never been to church in my life. So she invited me to a just huge church, which was sort of at the outskirts of the city because, Christians were persecuted big time way back then. And so I heard the message for the first time about the historicity of Jesus, that he is a historic figure, among other things. And the podium had a sign here. It said, Bog есть любовь. God is love. And for some reason, I repeat my story many times, but for some reason it grabbed me. I thought, if God is love, and I'm in love with Lily, so he's a good God. I relate to him. Didn't realize it was a verse from 1 John 4, 7, and 8. Just that God is love. That's how it all started. Well, then Lily came back in 1972 to say goodbye. And she said something like, well, I like you a lot. but you live in an idiotic country and we will never be together. And I had to agree. I said, that's absolutely true. Yeah, and I said, well, maybe we have a chance. So I didn't even know how to pray. I was just hoping that, well, maybe somehow. But our feelings were very strong, right, honey? In 1972 still. And she went back, and then 2 years later, we decided to get married. Folks, that's when the saga starts. Two very naive people. We applied for a marriage license, and they would not give me a marriage license. And I said, why? And they said, well, you're actually crazy. You're insane. You're psychologically impaired. And that's their trick. Till this very day, they do that to people. And you just have to obtain some documents or some whatever from psychiatric asylums. So we went to psychiatric asylums. Can you imagine, a naive girl from Minnesota? We saw things like you would not believe, real crazies. And you come to a director and said, I'm Victor Bernitsky, I'm on a city soccer team, excuse me, and I'm no crazy. And he says, are you sure? I said, so KGB talked to you already. So the story goes on, and finally my friend, sound engineer, says, Victor, you have to go to Moscow. Nothing is decided in Kiev, nothing. Go to American embassy. Show them what they do to Americans, because they were very nasty to Lily and stuff. So we thought of a very ingenious plan that I will be an American. Lily brought me Levi's. I had my deodorant, so I smelled like an American, And the trick was to go to Moscow on a sly. Folks, it was not easy because you need to show your passport everywhere you go. So we went on the train and we bribed the conductor. And she says, well, and who is she? Lily speaks Russian because she took Russian at the University of Minnesota. I said, well, she's from Latvia. She's just going to defend her thesis in Moscow. Lying. But Lily's accent was like a Baltic accent, like Scandinavian countries, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, those three. So we went to Moscow. We're approaching American embassy, and we thought, well, I speak the language already sort of decent, and I thought, well, who would ever detect my accent, especially natives? They would not be able to do that. Americans would. But she says, yes. Well, thank you. I'm trying. Well, so the guy comes out of that booth, the deal where he sees everybody. You cannot see what's in the booth. And I expected some sort of a hillbilly guy, Well, the guy is like 6'2", very intelligent face, and speaks British English. Hi, how are you? Is it your first time in Moscow? What have you seen so far? Well, I knew that sooner or later they will ask us for passports, right? We had a story there. If those of you who traveled in the former Soviet Union, are there any, incidentally? Nobody? You're so lucky. Well, when you go to this very day, when you go to Russia, they take your passports for 2 or 3 days. You know why? They want to check you, whether you're with FBI, CIA, NSA, all of those. Well, every time Lily would come, they will take her passport away for 2 or 3 days. So we thought that if they were to ask us for passports, we would tell them that we left our passports at, there was a big, huge hotel, no longer. It's called Россия. Россия. Americans cannot say Россия. They will say Rossiya, right? Because it's a guttural R. It's not a flipped R. So I thought, if that's the question, I will say that it's Rossiya. So the guy is just all pleasantries. Oh, where were you? So we started telling him where we went. Have you seen Mausoleum of Lenin? Oh, of course. And we were there. The guy is like a Barbie doll. He's shrinking every year. He's like about 4'2" now. And I said, yeah, we saw the guy, it was very interesting and stuff. And then he said, incidentally, can I see your passport, please? I said, we actually left our passports at, Rosia down the block, and I rolled my R as hard as I possibly could. And he says, good. So he was absolutely positive we are from US of A. Then Lily started talking, and who would you like to see? And Lily had a guy that she called before. And so he says, go ahead. I couldn't walk. I was so paralyzed. Lily says, go. My knees would not move. Folks, the reason for that is simply this. I am the officer, and I'm going to American Embassy. It's 10 years automatic in Siberia. Automatic. It's a court-martial. That's what it's called. You're a spy. You're trying to give some information to Americans. So in that embassy, we talked to the guy. James Huff is his name. We realized that the entire embassy was eavesdropped, and they call it a special signal, like microwave signal. I wrote about that in my book. It was horrible. They started in 52, and the entire embassy was going through radiation pretty much. And a number of families had their kids, stillbirth. They had stillbirth because of that. So we explained our thing. It's a long story. I would move on. They said, okay, go to Kiev. We already called the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. That should be no problem. We go to Kiev on a train. Incidentally, the driver of a big limousine is not American. That's what boggles my mind. Why not American? A Russian guy, an informer. So you cannot even talk in the car. Excuse me. Arriving to Kiev, no, we have not confirmed that you're, normal. You're not normal. So mind you, that's guests there getting ready for a wedding, and I was born downtown Kiev. I knew hundreds of people. No, you cannot. Would you believe that we went back the second time? Let me back up a little bit. We told the story to our kids, and they say, well, we believe you. After all, you're a pastor. You would not lie, but your story is like far-fetched. Americans would not believe it. How can you fool KGB several times? You cannot. About 5 years ago, Lily entered her last name just for the fun of it. Remember WikiLeaks? All of a sudden there's an information, WikiLeaks, and there's a letter which is classified, had been classified for 31 years. It's in my book at the end of the book. Americans knew everything about us. They were rooting for us. American ambassador Walter Stossel, born again incidentally, died early because of that radiation, 62 years old. He wrote a personal letter to the Secretary of State. You remember who he was? Henry Kissinger. That was under Ford administration. So Soviets were about to sign the Helsinki Declaration in 1975. There was declaration about unification of families. They let me out as the first Ukrainian in 58 years of the Soviet regime. Should I tell you real quick that at the very end, I had already American visa, and my mom is calling me from school, says, come quick, I have to tell you something. So I come to her cabinet office, and she says, you're not going anywhere. They're going to do something very ishy to you. I said, what? I have American visa. I have, people rooting for me. No, she says not. Well, you know what happened? In my mom's school, there was a lady whose husband was a bigwig with KGB, actually a colonel of KGB. And they loved my mother because their son was in my mom's school. And my mom was very nice to him, and he was not very bright, but she graduated him from grade to grade. And so the lady says, this is our civil duty to tell you that Victor is not going anywhere, and here's what's going to happen to him. And so she tells my mom that Victor will be summoned to a KGB office, that he'll be interrogated. They will try to first to tell him how wonderful he is. He is this, he is that. And then if he doesn't listen, and they will force him to annul the marriage, because we were married already, you know. And I missed that point with you. We were married, and then they kicked her out 3 days later. So she's in U.S., I'm in Ukraine. So anyways, and then they said, they will try to provoke him to anger. And if that happens, then 2 agents will walk in, will give him an injection of turpentine, pretty much to kill him. My mom hears all of that. I'm the most beloved son. My mom goes crazy. And she's a communist. Remember, all of a sudden, within a second, that ideology changes. How? My son, he is the brightest. How could they do that? So anyways, she tells me the story. I said, Mama, I don't believe that. I'm sorry, I don't. She talks to the lady, that colonel's wife, to come and tell me the story. And she says, well, if they find out, you know, I mean, we'll be exiled to Siberia. I mean, that'll be the end of it. But she agreed. So I met the lady. She told me the story. Now that's when you get real afraid for once. And she says, just keep your calm. Don't be provoked to anger. And being not a Christian, what else can she say? Or she says, this is my civil duty to tell you that. She starts crying. And my goodness. So, yeah, all of that is in the book. She says, go faster. Okay, I got it. Right. Yeah, and I'll tell him about Ukraine too. So anyways, that's how it all happened. And I went there. There was interrogation. They tried to started yelling at me and swearing at me, and I didn't say anything. It had to be Jesus, for sure, because way back then, you know, I would probably fight, but I didn't. And then I finally told him, I said, Comrade Captain, I said, my only offense is that I love my wife. I'm not going to, to forget our marriage and stuff like that. So that's what it is. And he was moved when I said that. You know, I truly told him that, said, listen, come on. And so he went to a different room, started calling his superior, saying, I don't know what to do with him. My mom, who was with me, entered the room, and we both, that's a long story, folks, but that's all true. To every comma, it's true. And so we went home, and then already the guy calls our, apartments. Where's Victor? Mama says, no, Victor is in the United States. He says, really? He just talked to me 10 minutes ago. So that's how it was all. Lily says, that all of that is in the book. It's like a movie script, for real. But Lily says, well, why don't you talk a little bit about Ukraine? And I was planning to. Now, as I talked to Dieta, Ukraine suffered under the Russians from day one. When the Russians took over in 1917, then vast areas of Ukraine were actually under siege, and then they conquered the entire territory. And in 1922, they declared the birth of the former Soviet Union. That's when it was, in December. In fact, in December of 1991, the Soviet Union disintegrated, remember? So Ukraine was feeding all the Russians there, other lands, because Russia is comprised of a number of peoples and stuff like that, like Kyrgyz, Tatars, and all of that. So then in 1933, and that's Dieta wanted me to say that too, in 1933, you remember that Ukraine went to horrible genocide. 1932, 1933, Russians would come to Ukrainian villages and take everything that they had, including wheat, to be sown next year. So there was famine, horrible famine. cannibalism and stuff like that. They killed just about 6.5 million Ukrainians way back then. Ukrainians never forget that, and Russians never forget that. Russians wanted to control Ukraine. Ukraine always wanted to be independent and free. When I see the word freedom in Ukraine, there is a symbol of Ukraine. It's like a trident, you might recall. Trident, it's on my phone. Lily might show you. And that trident actually is a word, and it's freedom, voля, voля. You know when they got that? In the 10th century. Ukraine in the 10th and 11th century was the strongest, officially the strongest kingdom in Europe. It was Kievan Rus, it was called, Golden Age of the Kievan Rus. They had intermarriages. There were a lot of nobility marrying Scandinavian ladies and stuff like that. So Ukraine had quite an influence in Europe. Then in terms of how things are today, well, real quick, you understand that the war today is 309, well, it's 2.5 years, actually more than 2.5 years since they invaded. They invaded in February, 22nd of February, 2022. Since we're in the church, I would like to illustrate that. Ukraine pretty much looks like the United States. This is our Florida, right? Pretty much. That's Ukraine. That's Crimea. So in 2014, Russians took Crimea. I wanted to quote you from the book, but real quick. When they invaded Crimea, the acting president of Ukraine was Turchinov. He's a Jewish believer. I know him personally. We preached together. Turchinov calls the United States. Guess who he called to? Biden. Biden was in charge of Ukraine at that point. Remember, his son was with Burisma, and he says, "What do we do?" And Biden said, I quote, "Stand down, we will take care of it." That's what Turchinov told me. It's in the book, and in the picture of Turchinov too. So stand down, we'll take care of it. They never did. Americans could have did some, just some protests or whatever, and Ukrainians could defend themselves. They had several garrisons there. They could have done that. No, first it was just a few detachments of the Russian soldiers. So that's how it all started. Why? Because of the weakness of the administration. So Putin saw that. There was Obama, there was Biden. Biden's son was compromised big time with Burisma. You remember? He was getting $82,000 a month without knowing anything at all. And I remember how Biden said, well, unless the Attorney General Viktor Shokin forgets about that, Ukraine would not receive $1 billion in aid. I mean, talking about quid pro quo, I mean, openly, highly compromised. And so Ukrainians started having second thoughts, like, we're not getting anywhere because they start marching on and on. So he waited for a while. So he took Crimea, and then he started infiltrating into Donetsk and Lugansk. Folks, those are very rich areas of Ukraine. That's where coal is, okay? Then, of course, 2.5 years ago, they started the war, and Putin starts annexing Zaporozhye region and Kherson region. Well, that's 38% of the entire territory of Ukraine. So now Putin says, we can end the war if we keep all of those territories, annexed territories. I don't know what will be happening. I understand that there'll be a decision or maybe some negotiations and stuff like that. If it continues to be the present administration, they'll continuously give Ukraine a little bit of this, a little bit of that to extend the war. It could have been done a little differently, from the very beginning. It could have been done with F-15s, just differently. Now, of course, Ukrainians are asking for Storm Shadow ballistic missiles because all of those bombs and rockets are coming from airports that are within Russia. So Ukraine said, they came to the White House a week ago and they said, well, we know exactly where it's coming from. Give us the right or permission is the word to to go and to go with storm shadows and bomb that. So permission is not issued till this very day. British guys were asking the White House to allow them to give storm shadow missiles. They are not doing that. So the situation is very dire. I don't know what will be happening, but since we're in the church, and there's a number of prophecies about Russia, you know that. In Ezekiel 38, the Lord is talking about final days. Now, remember, Ezekiel wrote his prophecy 537 years before the birth of Christ. So he knew only Asia, Africa, and Europe, right? So in Ezekiel 38, the Lord is speaking to Ezekiel, and he says, "Son of man, turn your face against Gog in the land of Magog, with principalities of Rosh, R-O-S-H, Tubal, and Meshech," easily identifiable as Russia, because people who are living in the north, from Tel Aviv, you're looking at, Jerusalem rather, you're looking straight at Moscow, and you have a map there. It's interesting. So we read that Russia will attack in the final days people who were brought back from the sword, living peacefully on the mountains of Israel. My question to my church was, who is living peacefully, relatively, on the mountains of Israel, and since when? The answer is 1948. That's when Israel was born. So the prophecy is beyond 1948. That is in our days. They're supposed to attack. You might recall they're not attacking alone. They're attacking with Persia since 1936, Iran, Ethiopia or Kush, Libya or Put, Fogarma from the north, Turkey today or Turkey. And when you look at all of that stuff, you're thinking, my goodness, look how nations are aligning. I remember some 15, 20 years when we read that prophecy, Iran was misbehaving, but today they're in cahoots with Russia, so much so that they're sending Russia weapons from Iran. When October 6th happened, and what happened to the Jewish people, of course, it's horrible. But when Iranians bombed Israel, I thought for sure Netanyahu will go all the way like they did before. Remember, they sent their pilots and bombed Ford Low plant. That's where uranium is being enriched as we talk. Remember, present administration allowed them to do that, which was horrible. And so, but they never did that. And I'm just wondering theologically, well, why didn't they do that? But I think sooner or later, the question with Ukraine will be resolved somehow, and they will move from the south into Israel right here. So that's at least my understanding of that. And I talked to other people. When I was in Israel in '84, I talked to them about it. And they said, Victor, we're not afraid of anybody. We're not afraid of any of our adversaries. Adversaries? How about 22 countries of the Arab Confederacy? Adversaries. They're surrounded by enemies. But the pastor said, we are afraid of only one country, and that is Gog Magog, which is Russia. Okay? So I don't know how we're doing with time. I know there'll be a break, but we live in the most precarious times since the beginning of the world, because everything that we see today is being fulfilled before our very eyes. Look how nations are aligning. Look what's happening with economies of the world. Look what's happening to lilacs in Minnesota. All of a sudden they're blooming. That is, I've never seen anything like that in my life. All of a sudden they lost all the leaves. We have huge bush. Now they're blooming. So there is global warming of sorts. I talked about that, and I think it's of the Lord. I think that the Lord is warming up the earth. You know why I think that way? Because of 2 Peter, 2nd chapter. Didn't the Lord tell Peter that the earth and the elements thereof shall burn? We're looking for a new earth where truth will abide. So today's earth is temporal or ephemeral. It will go away. There'll be new heavens and new earth. We know that. So that's what's happening. So maybe we can take a little break, and then afterwards maybe there'll be some questions, and I will maybe tell you a couple more things, but primarily what is happening in the United States is unbelievable to me. I mean, I living here for 49 years, remembering how I entered the United States and the ethics of the United States, and how God-believing country it was from the very beginning. It still is, I think, for some of us here. And when I go anywhere and I travel around the world, I said, listen, this is US of A. That is the only country on the face of this earth that actually writes in God we trust on their money. The only one in the entire world. And I said, we give credence to God. The only problem is that that faith is ephemeral these days, that people are staying away from faith. And of course, my prayer, anywhere I go, I pray for the United States, and I pray for Christians that they will be very strong. Dieta sent me materials of people who spoke to you before. Incidentally, big hello from Kim Crockett, you remember her? Contender for the Secretary of State. I married this couple. Yes, we're good friends. But so what's happening is we have to witness to people because we don't have much time for that. Save as many people as we possibly can. Just tell them the gospel. Tell them what's happening, and if they doubt that for a second, tell them what's happening politically, how the world is aligning against Israel. And sooner or later, there'll be a big attack there. We pray to God that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob will stand for Israel. Just like folks, like he is standing for Ukraine. Putin wanted my city of Kiev to be conquered in 3 days, remember? It's been more than 3 days today, 2.5 years. All right, so we'll have a little break, and then maybe Patty, whatever, and then we'll come back, okay?
Ministry. I appreciate that too. So go ahead and head back to the table, and the restrooms are to the back and to the right. And then we'll come back and we'll do some Q&A because, like you said, he's got 80 years of an amazing story. So we'll dig into it a little bit more when you come back. Thanks.